Hello everyone, I'm Daniel Steele, your instructor for SPPH 538, and I'm coming to you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. In this lecture, I'm going to talk to you about public health and human rights, and this will cover the Liao reading from week 5. All right, so let's jump right in. So to understand what the Liao paper is getting at, it's important, I think, to have a sense of what it's reacting against. And what it's really reacting against, I think, is the sort of in a very expansive notion of health and of the right to health that's associated with the World Health Organization. So you're probably familiar with these definitions, but I'll remind you of them anyway. So the World Health Organization defines health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And it defines the right to health as the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of health is as one of the fundamental rights of every human being without distinction of race, religion, political belief, or economic or social condition. Now, Liao's view of the WHO's view on right to health is essentially that it kind of goes overboard, that it goes too far. And he wants to propose instead that people have a right to basic health, not to the highest attainable standard of health. And we'll explain, first of all, what he means by a right to basic health, and then why Liao thinks it makes more sense to say there's a right to basic health, not to the highest attainable standard of health. Okay, so Liao proposes the idea of that there's a right to basic health, not the highest attainable standard of health. So let's think about this view. What is this idea about? So Liao's view is based on the idea that rights are really protecting not everything that's good in life, but conditions that are fundamental for a good life. So, for example, you would have a right to adequate nutrition, but you don't have a right to eat, say, caviar. You have a right to education, but you don't have a right to go to Harvard. You don't have a right, to own a private jet or a mansion, right? You have a right to housing. You don't have a right to a 50,000 square foot mansion or something like that. Okay, so that's this key idea, fundamental conditions, not everything that you might like. Okay, so what are these fundamental conditions? Liao distinguishes 3 types. There are goods like foods, water, and shelter, and so on. There's capacities, abilities to think, to act, to work, just to do stuff. And there's options. You have opportunities for education, employment, and so on. And Liao thinks everybody's got a right to these kinds of things. And again, remember the idea is you have a right to these fundamental things, but not to everything. So basic health. Basic health is defined by Liao as follows. An individual has basic health if the various life processes, organ systems, and so on that are needed for the development and exercise of the fundamental capacities in the individual are adequately functioning. Remember, the fundamental capacities included the ability to think and act and work. Okay, so a few clarifications. I found that students will often interpret basic health to be purely physical health and not to include mental health. I think that's a misunderstanding of what Liao is saying. I think it's quite clear that since the basic capacities include things like the ability to think and to act, it's clear that serious mental health conditions can compromise those capacities. So, major depression, for example, could undermine your ability to think and act effectively. Similarly, I think it's quite clear from Liao that he understands social determinants of health to be important to establishing conditions in which basic health can be met. So things like housing, education, etc. These are going to be important for people to meet their basic health. So I think it would be a misinterpretation to take Liao to be saying that basic health is only about sort of physical health and only about healthcare or something. I think it's quite clear that's not what he means. Okay, so the basic idea then is that everyone has a right to the conditions that are fundamental for pursuing a good life. That's sort of his fundamental starting assumptions about right. Again, the idea is you have a right to these fundamental things, not to everything. And then the idea is that, well, basic health is fundamental to pursuing a good life. That seems pretty straightforward. If you don't have basic health, it's going to be difficult for you to do lots of other things in life that, might help you improve your situation or promote your well-being. And therefore, from these two premises, he argues everyone has a right to basic health. So here at this point, Liao's sort of trying to convince people who might think that maybe there is no such thing as a right to health, people who might be skeptical about the idea that there could be a right to health. And there are some philosophers who have that kind of skeptical attitude about rights to health. But I think for our purposes, the main disagreement point that people, at least in public health, and I find students in this class are likely to have, is whether there's a right to something more than the right to basic health. And so that's what we're going to consider now, is consider why Liao wants to limit the right to health to basic health, and why wouldn't he want to have the right to the highest attainable standard of health. Well, to understand that, it's important to think about how different rights can kind of sometimes come into conflict or friction or competition with one another. And that's important to keep in mind, because you might sort of naively think that if you've got a right to something, then that absolutely, totally means you should get it. And if you're not getting it, then, you can go and, go take your claim to court and you can get that right. But reality is more complicated, because there can be trade-offs between rights. So here are two types of cases that are relevant to health and to public health. So in the first type of case, the exercise of one person's right impinges on the fulfillment of another's right. And this is something that came up quite a bit during the COVID-19 pandemic. So, in that pandemic, one person's right to, say, freedom of association, to go to the movies, or to go to a choir practice, or go to a concert, or go to a religious gathering. Those things obviously could become events where COVID-19 could spread very rapidly, and then, of course, infect other people who didn't attend that event. And so, therefore, there was an argument for prohibiting many of these events, many of these types of gatherings, in order to protect the right to health of other people. Another type of case where you can get frictions or competitions among rights arises when there isn't enough resources to satisfy all the rights that people have. And so this can happen if the government doesn't have sufficient funds, for example, to provide all the medications that people need. In that case, you somehow have to decide who to prioritize. So the basic concern then is that a right to the highest attainable standard of health would just create too much friction. It would create this sort of constant conflict between people's rights to health all the time. And here are two examples to illustrate how that could happen. So the first example is this dream job, and this is an example based on something that's mentioned in the Liao reading. So imagine Bill and Sue are competing for the same job. They both really want this job. For both of them, it's their dream job that they've always wanted. But only one person can get that job. There's only one of them. And so the person who doesn't get that job will suffer psychological distress and not achieve their highest attainable standard of health, understood as a state of complete well-being. Okay, but does that mean they both have a right to their dream job? Notice that according to Liao, he would say, no, you don't. No one has a right to their dream job. You have a right to adequate nutrition. You have a right to basic health, but you don't have a right to the happiest life you could possibly have. The second example, NIMBY, this one isn't in the Liao reading. In this example, Dr. Katz is opposing a new apartment building in her neighborhood that would block the sea view to her house. And this apartment building is being built to include some subsidized social housing units so that people who are lower income can have a place to live. But Dr. Katz says, look, this is going to block my view, and that view is essential to my mental health. So the WHO says I have a right to it. And imagine you're shouting at a housing advocate who's saying, no, we need to have more housing. So again, in this case, if you have a right to the highest attainable standard of health, it seems like Dr. Katz has a right to her view. So in general, the problem seems to be that the WHO's expansive view of the right to health seems to entail that everybody's rights to health are just always conflicting with everybody else's rights to health. And the idea for Liao is to say, wait a minute, this is why it doesn't make any sense to say that everybody has a right to the highest attainable standard of health they could possibly have. Because that just depends on so many things that are not possible to satisfy for everybody. Not everybody can live in a mansion. Not everyone can have a sea view. Not everyone can get the dream jobs. It's just impossible for everybody to have all these things. And yet, those things can contribute to your highest attainable standard of health, right? If you're taking that into include, your psychological and social well-being and all these things. So Liao's approach then is to limit the scope of the right of health so that people's rights to health don't conflict as much. Notice there could still be conflicts, like maybe if there's not enough funding to give everybody the essential medications that they need, then there would be trade-offs, but again, that's something that can happen among different rights. But the idea is that for Liao's view is that it makes this kind of friction much more manageable, according to this view. So what would the WHO say about this kind of thing? Say about this situation, that is, when different rights seem to be in friction or in competition with one another? It would be a mistake to think that people at the WHO are not aware of this. Clearly they are, and they have ways of trying to answer this. So this is a quote from a WHO website where they're discussing this situation. And in particular, they're discussing situations where there are insufficient resources to provide what's needed to meet the health rights of everyone who's there. And they say, well, in this kind of case, a rights-based approach to health requires that health policy and programs prioritize the needs of those furthest behind first, towards greater equity. That's kind of confusing in its wording and framing, but the idea is clearly an example of what we mentioned before as prioritarianism. That is to say, those who are sort of the least well off or those who have the greatest need should be prioritized when distributing scarce resources. So if we think about that in connection with the example of Dr. Katz and the apartment building that includes social housing that would block Dr. Katz's multi-million-dollar view, clearly prioritarianism would say, well, look, if we're thinking about somebody's right to housing, that's going to be prioritized over Dr. Katz's right to have this wonderful view from her house. And so this would be a way of trying to address these kinds of frictions. So notice, according to the WHO view, Dr. Katz really would have a right to this view. It's just that the other right of people to housing would take precedence, would get priority over that right. And so according to the WHO view, you would say, sure, Dr. Katz, you do have a legitimate claim about a right, but we're going to have to prioritize this other right of people to have a place to live, because that's a greater need, and we're going to prioritize the needs of those furthest behind. And the people who just don't have housing at all are further behind than Dr. Katz, who's got a beautiful house and a beautiful view. Okay, so this then is concluding the lecture about Liao. Again, the idea is to emphasize a right to basic health and to suggest that a right to basic health is more defensible in Liao's view than a right to health that focuses on the highest attainable standard. And this is something we can talk about in class, about whether we agree or disagree with Liao's take on this subject. Okay, bye-bye.